Today on the Videomaker Podcast, we talk all about time or time manipulation. Time manipulation mostly happens in post-production and in editing to stretch or compress time, but it does actually touch a little bit of shooting technique as well, so we'll talk about both. All that and more coming up. But first, I want to quickly make you aware of Videomaker's email newsletter. It's full of great Videomaker articles covering the art and technology of video production. You'll find how-to articles, articles that cover the concepts and principles of visual storytelling, reviews of the latest video cameras and software, a roundup of the latest video news, buyer's guides that cover everything from camera support, computers, field monitors, and tons more. Plus, if you want to get alerts about our free instructional webinars and receive invitations to our in-person networking events across the United States, the Videomaker email newsletter is the best way to stay up to speed. Sign up today at videomaker.com/newsletter. That's videomaker.com/newsletter. Now, on to the show. Welcome to the Videomaker Podcast. I'm Mike Wilhelm, and with me, as always, to my right is Nicole Lajeunesse.
Hello.
And to my left is Chris Monlux.
What's happening?
And today we're talking all about time manipulation, which is one of my favorite topics, mainly because I'm such a fan of time travel movies, and that's like the most fun implementation of this, I guess, right? But really, this is a podcast kind of about editing, which editing is all about time manipulation, compression, and expansion of time. That's what editing does. You cut out the unnecessary stuff, I guess, right? Yep. Similar to the way editing text is kind of about economy of words. Editing images is about economy of time and images. So let's start with just sort of the basics, which is compression of time. Basically, anytime you ever edit any kind of video, it really is compressing time. So, Nicole, this might be like your particular area of expertise, being a film studies major, right? So maybe we'll start with you. What are your thoughts on this topic generally?
Yeah, a lot of so you in film theory and film studies, you talk about like how things are constructed or how like the story is constructed, and part of that is how time is constructed and conveyed, and like the other half is like how space is constructed. So you have to like think about it as you're presenting these ideas to your audience, and you get to control how they're presented, and one of the ideas that you're presenting is how time is flowing through your narrative.
A really basic version of this is something like, you need a character to get to point A in one scene to point B in the next scene, and you generally don't show the person stepping outside the door and walking to the car and starting the ignition and getting in and driving over there and then getting out and walking to the next door. You just cut that out.
The movie Snatch does this in like little 20-second cut scenes, and you go all the way from the United States to the UK in a second, showing the airplane taking off and then the guy taking a shot and then getting into a cab and all those kinds of things. It's compressing the experience, but still telling the story of travel, but not taking the time to go, here's my ticket counter person, and walking down the tarmac and doing all that kind of stuff, right?
Right. So like Mike just said, you're compressing that space, and you like doing aiming towards an economy of sorts of your narrative. So you're not putting in a bunch of details that don't contribute anything to like the overall story that you're telling.
Totally. I've had times where that's difficult to make a choice because you want to try something out, or you have some beautiful thing that you want to include in the story, but it's just not economical to the story to include it. And so it's like that's one reason why you exclude something is my time doesn't. This isn't going to work. Now for me, a lot of TV commercials, I was always working in 30 seconds, but regardless of how long amount of time you have, you still have a limited amount of time. I can't imagine someone that's making a student film should start off making a long Lord of the Rings length feature.
No, in fact, I remember this triggered a memory of my very first project in the video production class I took in high school was a 1-minute short, and specifically 1 minute exactly, so that we could practice compressing time and telling stories in shorter periods of time. It was like the constraint was supposed to spur on our creativity, and I think it did, but it also helped us learn like what can you actually leave out and still say something.
Totally. Well, and there's also the fun little task of trying to do in-camera editing, right? So shooting everything in sequence that you're going to do, you only get one take of it, and it slams against the thing that you're going to shoot next. Now it's kind of hard to do that with media these days, but I guess it'd be sequential shots put together or what have you. It's not like, we used to put it on a tape and then all the things would just come together. You
just play it back.
Yeah, but you're having to sequence stuff and you're having to do that. Now we talk about like the idea of compressing time. We can make time seem, years in a movie, decades, centuries,
right?
All the way to a 2-hour movie from 4 hours. It might be an evening, right? That like started after school. I think of Days Confused is this way of like there's a little bit of school and then there's this whole evening. Yet they didn't spend a bunch of time, even though they might have been at school for 8 hours. Working on telling the story of the school. It was all the stories after that.
Interesting that you mentioned the days and years and decades. Everyone knows the most famous jump cut of all time, right? Nicole? No? Okay.
I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, so 2001, right? When the throws the bone in the air, it's like, I don't remember what the date on the first, third of 2001 was, but, they're like the proto-humans.
Right.
One of them throws the bone up in the air, and it's a jump cut to a satellite, and it jumps forward, like hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years or something in just a single, second of time.
Or a fraction of a second of a time.
And, exactly. And not only are you skipping over whatever irrelevant parts of history, of human history in that case, that aren't relevant to the story that's being told, it's like matching up those two, like the first tool and like the last tool or something like that, however you want to like think about it. But it's like creating that connection.
Yeah, that film is all about humankind and their tools. So
right.
That's a particularly that's the other reason why it was so famous, right? Not only did it jump so forward in time and instantaneously, but also it had the match cut of those two things. It was like the bone flying up in the air. It was like the same shape as the satellite and everything. Mm-hmm. So that was particularly important there. But, there's basically two ways to do this. And most stories, I think, use both of them. So there's the compression of time that happens sort of between scenes that we've been talking about, like, getting across town. Mm-hmm. But there's also like a time compression that happens within a scene. So if you consider, for example, just like the act of someone getting in their car and starting the engine, a lot of times that happens in a story where you're not seeing literally every second of the process that it takes to get in your car and start the engine. There's like a cut where, the person closes the door and then the next thing is the ignition starting right away. You don't see the person like digging through their pockets and
their keys, or where
settling
the buckle is and all that kind of stuff. I think the other thing about expansion of time is you can also put it in all sorts of weird order, right? Too, like Pulp Fiction is an expansion of time, but then reordered in a way different way. So not only are you making all this editing, but you're also going, I'm going to put C in front of A and B in front of Z, and I guess that's already there, but regardless, that you can then move around in time and have parallel editing. Now, that's not necessarily the most classic view of parallel, being two stories at the same time going together, but you can have that in time. There's, obviously like movies where people are actually talking to each other through time or actually moving through time, but we're talking about the actual editing time.
Yeah.
Like editing down that space, but
editing, when you're talking about compression, you're talking about like just skipping over the parts that you don't need, and in that you can choose what to put next to each other. So like I guess Pulp Fiction is a good example. It's been a while since I've seen that one, where there's lots of storylines happening and they overlap and the timing isn't exactly parallel when you're watching one vignette versus the other vignette, but they're still like happening simultaneously. Well, and you're just choosing what to compress and what to juxtapose, and those, like, it creates meaning by putting those different timelines together in whatever way you choose.
That's an example of a story that is using compression and expansion simultaneously, right? On the small level, time is being compressed within a scene. But on the sort of macro level, as you look at the whole film, you are seeing events that are supposed to have been taking place at the same time.
Right.
And so in that sense, you're expanding it.
Tarantino does a lot of time manipulation in his stories, and like in Pulp Fiction he uses it for the holding the story back. He's showing you parts so you start to understand and put the story together, so by the time you get to the pinnacle of the story, you get all of the different parts, and then they start working together, and then it starts speeding up, maybe in the actions that happen, or maybe just in the speed of the cut. But there's all that. I think of one of Tarantino's first films, which was 4 Rooms. It was actually 4 rooms in a hotel that were all doing something, and there's a butler that goes in, and each scene is in like real time, but the butler supersedes all time. So you see 4 different scenes, and the butler comes in, or maybe it's not butler, it's the bellhop, comes in and out of the scenes in the same amount of time. So he's transgressing time, so you get to see each time, but each scene gives you a little bit of information on why he's acting that way in the next scene, or in the next story, so to speak.
So then it's about like choosing when to speed up or slow down time. And I think that Tarantino is super aware of like the power, like the tools that cinema gives you to do that kind of thing and to manipulate the audience experience, and then you can play with it. The more you understand it, the more you can play with it like that.
Totally. When you can end up making real time feel faster or slower even, or I guess more slow than if you cut a bunch before, you can make real time feel more exciting too. So the how you're placing your space compression can really play out the scene, and the feel of the beat of the cut can be the time you're cutting it so that the dialogue's happening more on top of each other. Like people that are talking don't typically have brilliant things to say immediately when the next person gets done with something, but you're compressing that time so that the beats and the energy of that scene start to build and drive as well.
So before we get too deep into time expansion and these kind of crazy overlaps and sort of cross-timing issues, I want to get back to compressing real quick and just talk about like how does compressing time manifest when you're talking about a story that is not just a classic film or a classic scene where an event is unfolding. So like a commercial is a good example of this, where there is kind of a story essentially in just about every type of video, commercials included, but in those sense the story is more like a message more than anything, right?
Or like a theme at best. It's like really
vague,
overarching, generalness. I mean, your theme might be the sale of the commercial that you're that the story is just that, and whatever you're telling, you might not, there's no reason to have people come in and leave or what have you, as far as time being even real to, or even applicable to the story.
I can tell you when I was doing commercials, though, I used time compression all the time because you just simply had however much message you needed to fit in, and it must be 30 seconds. Yeah. And sometimes you would edit the whole thing together and it'd be 35 seconds. You got to find 5 seconds to get rid of. And then you're looking at the type of time compressions where it's like, well, there's a little pause between, when the person says this word and the next word. I can slice out a little bit out of that part.
Yeah, how do I shave a few seconds here or a few frames here and there, and then even speed up stuff? I remember doing that with voiceovers. It's like, man, this voiceover's great, but it lasts 35 seconds. I got to cut out all the gaps and all the breaths, but I also then have to speed up maybe some of the statements so that you can actually get it in there, but it doesn't feel like it's too fast. Like, how do you speed something up without it feeling like a faster pace? Well, and that's I think sometimes the difficulty there.
That's like just pointing out that editing inherently almost always is time compressed. Like, that's what you're doing. Like, that's the default mode of editing, is you're getting rid of the gaps and the breaths that are unnecessary or whatever. And so you're talking about like actually editing out parts of the time that you recorded, which is like what you have to do. Like, you're leaving out parts of the pro-filmic event is what it's called. It's like what happens in front of the camera. But you can also leave out parts of the like scene that you just skip over that like weren't ever in the pro-filmic event, and you just like skipped over them, like you planned to skip over them for narrative reasons or whatever.
There's a lot of that.
Like, I don't know, that's 2 different levels of time compression, I guess.
Yeah, well, and I think that plays well too, is like a series of ads or what have you. You might do a 60 second, a 30 second, and a 15 second of the same message, and each one of them cut out obviously the less important stuff, but it also might be that you started with that longer form so that everybody understood the premise. So then you could just show them information that you didn't have to set up the premise anymore. You could just get right to the punchline or whatever your point was.
And then other types of video, like event videos, or particularly like wedding videos that are really kind of montages, are a bit more straightforward, in the sense that you might have some part of the video that is really kind of real time. You might hold on the ceremony itself when the couple is doing their vows, and that's a real time thing, maybe with very few edits, if any at all. And then you sort of transition into this montage-y kind of thing where
just showing events.
You got to squeeze in the next 2 hours in 4 minutes or something.
Right.
Well,
montage
and of course,
is like a super obvious example of time compression. That's like, don't know what time compression is, watch a montage. Like that's it.
Yeah.
But it also happens in such more subtle levels. Like within each scene, you're leaving out parts that your brain would have left out. Like if it was in your memory, like that's not stuff that matters, so you don't even notice that it's not there.
So montage for sure. I didn't even think about montage as time compression, but it is like the ultimate example. You could look at Rocky training for the fight, and he's a nobody, and then 3 minutes later, after you hear Eye of the Tiger, he's like a champion.
He's up on the top of the stairs going
So let's see, other areas where time compression might be important. Training videos, perhaps, in the sense that you're trying to communicate an entire process or procedure for a thing.
Most things in real time are boring. That's like, if you're trying to demonstrate or show someone how to do something, why are you not just showing them, okay, well, if I have these tools, I can make this more efficient. So instead of showing you this thing that takes an hour to do, I can take 15 minutes to show you how to do it. You don't have to actually explain the whole thing.
Yeah, and by the way, just as a side note, that is both really nice and really infuriating as a viewer, right? Like, have you ever done this thing where, here's an example. A friend of mine, his washing machine broke, and he's like, I think I can fix this. A washing machine is just like a bucket of water with a motor that spins it around. And so he watches this YouTube video, and the person on the video, shows how to fix the thing, and he takes it apart, and the video is like 15 minutes. It's mostly in real time. It's like the person is an expert. And he's like, no problem, and goes to do it himself, and it turns out it's a 3-hour job. You like that the video is compressed in a time efficient, and it doesn't take forever to watch it. At the same time, it sets kind of unrealistic expectations, at least when we're talking about a training video.
It reminds me of it's the analog of in person, yada yada yada. You just yada 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 that edit so that you got to the things that you thought were important. Well, especially when you're trying to do something, sometimes you're like, you just skipped over the thing I needed to learn. Damn it. That was, it was the premise of the thing was really where I get the conceptual thing. I just need that one step.
Yeah. That happened to me when I was rebuilding carburetors in my motorcycle. Yeah. It was like, there's a lot of parts in carburetors. Yeah, totally. And, they're piecing it together, and they're like, oh, then you just put all these in, and they start to do it, and it's like, boom, it's done. It's like, okay, got the screws in place, but dang it, I didn't really need to see which screw that was, because now I got 300 screws on the table, and I got to find the right one. But that's how it goes, I guess.
And that's why you get the speed up of the just speed up the film, or just the fast montage of that, of the building montage of everything sped up, and that can be done in real time sped up, or through time-lapse or something like that.
I think time-lapse is a super useful tool in educational content and tutorial videos and stuff like that, because then you don't have the waste of time basically to have to sit through the entire process in real time when you're about to do it yourself, also in real time. But you still get the benefit of seeing the entire process, step by step. So I always think of art videos and painting tutorials and stuff like that. They give you the little intro, and they set up their palette, and they tell you what they're going to do, and then you watch the rest in time lapse, and maybe there's some voiceover guiding you through it. But the time lapse is, obviously you're never going to be able to paint it that fast, even if you were as good as this person. But it shows you the steps.
Well, speaking of time-lapse, actually, time-lapse is also a great transition tool, right? If you're going between scenes in a story, a time-lapse of the sun setting is a good way to tell everyone, oh, it was daytime and now it's nighttime.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's only been 3 seconds.
And it's good at establishing all the rest of your next scene or what have you. The cool thing about time lapse that we don't get to think about very often in video is that you can also have a longer exposure, right? So the idea of expanding time so that it feels faster. So I'm shooting a 30-second exposure, so all the lines streak. So then when I put a bunch in a row, it makes time seem like it's moving even faster because I have a longer, so you're compressing time even more, but with light even now at that level.
Because you said expanding time, and I think that's incorrect. I think you're actually
you're
compressing time again on top of the compression that automatically is happening from the time lapse, because you're capturing more light time, more time of light.
Yeah, like each time is each sample of sample of things is more time within it. So it's compressing it even more, but it also is helping you communicate differently too. Of if there's streaks of things moving, all of a sudden this is really busy, and it's like, oh no, there was no drama in this until I made the exposure long, and then all of a sudden it felt like this really busy thing when maybe there was only 5 to-go orders at the restaurant you're shooting.
So time lapse is like the most overt version of time compression there is. Essentially, you're like pressing fast forward on the video, right?
Yeah.
Like in the case of the sun setting, it's like the scene ends, it's in the afternoon, and you're pressing fast forward and just hyper speed, you're zooming ahead to the evening.
What the most typical of that is the shot of the clock.
Yeah, right? Exactly. The clock is spinning around.
It's 4 hours later now. Okay.
Or like a lot of times the transition will be like calendars. That's another.
The calendar page is flying off the wall.
But
beard growing.
I mean, there's a reason though for those transitions. Like I think that time lapse is a great way to show passage of time. Crossfades also tend to compress time.
For sure. Yeah. Crossfades are interesting because you can do it one within a scene.
Yeah.
And say you're shooting a group of people in a room, and you put a crossfade in the middle. If nothing else changes, it's the same people, they're wearing the same clothes, the lighting's the same. It's gonna give off the impression that this is a little bit later.
Yeah. Yeah. Just I guess those are the conventions that have been ingrained in us.
Yeah.
Like I'm not sure, but that makes me think about the limitations of time compression. Like you need some sort of transition, like somehow some indication that time has passed, otherwise the audience isn't going to pick up on it.
Yeah.
If it's a big chunk of time, at least. What
would we call then stop motion would be expanding time?
No, it's
you're sampling it.
I think it's just like video, just like regular motion picture only.
Yeah. Or like one animation in general.
You just created a frame at a time.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because
that's even more.
You have to separate it from like actual, like again, pro filmic time, like the time it actually took to create the scene versus, like the time that you are trying to. The time that the story actually takes.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Because if you're cutting bits out of a scene, like back to the car example, you're cutting the part out where they're like settling in and getting their seatbelt on. Like it's still implied that happened. So you're compressing the time between getting in the car and starting it, versus like a time lapse where, like that probably is still happening because that's just the conventions of cinema. But like with stop motion, it's more of like you're conveying the scene just a little bit at a time.
Totally. Well, and you might represent real time, but you took 5 takes of it.
You're trying to represent, and that too is like you're always compressing actual time because it took you more time than your film is going to. Your filming time is going to be longer than your screen time, always.
And that's like the basis of the masses misunderstanding what it takes to make video. Is so many are like, I saw this thing and it was like the event, it was that event and that kind of thing, and it's done. It was like they thought in real time it happened. Like, I mean, you filmed it, but they think it came together in real time too. And you're like, oh no, it took me 16 hours to edit those 4 hours down to make you a 3-minute film,
right?
Or what have you, and that doesn't compute for a lot of people. It's like, oh, you didn't just get it done and now you shot it exists.
So we talked at length about compressing time. Let's go ahead and transition to expanding time. And like time lapse, the most obvious form of expanding time, I guess, is just like pure slow motion, right? You take a clip and crank the speed down,
make it slower.
Now you're expanding time.
Yeah, well, or you can get as complicated as like Inception, where like every scene time gets slower for real time, but not for the characters that are in it. It's just all a mind screw, I think, at that point. But
and that's like
But that's just
at the narrative level, I don't know how to say that and make it like a clear statement, but it's at the story level versus at the formal level.
Yeah, well, I mean, like the only things that really matter to keep that reality is like when those things match up. It's the transitions between time that really paved the way for that to be understood in the confines of the story, right? Like the one scene of them, waking up in the van. I can't even hardly remember how it all works, but I remember that was like 1 minute here was 1 second here was a tenth of a second here.
And if you're not like aware of that though, like if the story somehow
just transition there,
tell you that was happening, it like wouldn't.
It'd be really hard to figure out.
The time compression, the idea of time expansion would be different if there wasn't that like exposition to start off. You know what I mean?
Yeah, or like even the explanation how it all works. Like I think there's a scene where they're like talking about their plan, and so they get like so time's a little bit more explained to the viewer,
which is not. I mean, people love that movie, but I honestly don't think I've ever even watched the whole thing.
Inception.
Come on. But I mean, like if they have to explain it that much, like. You're supposed to avoid that kind of exposition in dialogue. So.
Well, it's more of a think of like Ocean's 11, where they're explaining their plot and they're showing all the things that's going to happen. Like it's that kind of thing. Like, okay, here's the plan. You're going to do this, and then to the viewer, you understand now how the time works. I think that's how it goes. I'm also thinking of Memento, where it's like
no explanation,
and like you no explanation. You're getting things in backwards order, and it's kind of more of the Tarantino thing where like the format of time is more so to keep you from to help with the climax in a different way, like to give you the story backwards so that you can understand where it started. Or Memento is a trick.
It's interesting. Sure. Time compression, I guess, is a lot more common because we picked the most mundane like examples to talk about time compression, and now as soon as we talk about expansion, it's like all these elaborate plot lines. Like what is like the basic example?
Well,
I mean slow motion, right?
Yeah, so it's
so how do you use that in a regular narrative?
It's interesting that we're even talking about Inception when we're talking about time expansion, because they're expanding time narratively, but not in their storytelling.
That's what I was trying to get at.
Like you're watching this movie that in the story it takes place over a few days. Even the dream sequence is like while someone's asleep on an airplane. Well, the movie is only an hour and a half or 2 hours long or something. Yeah, but they're asleep for 8 hours. The whole thing of like, the person is however many levels deep in the dream, and they're like living a lifetime. Well, we don't see their lifetime.
Right.
We're watching a 2-hour movie, so even that is compressed for us as viewers. The one I always think about. There's a few funny examples I think, which is of classic time expansion, is the timer ticking down on the bomb where they're trying to cut the blue wire. You've seen it. Like I don't remember what movie it was that was making fun of this, but that shows the time ticking down and they're sweating and all these things are happening, and they go back and the time is actually like increased and ticking down again. Exactly. I always like when those scenes happen. I want to take out a stopwatch. It says there's 10 seconds left. I'm like, I'm going to start a stopwatch and see if it really is 10 seconds. Of course, it never is.
That's almost like parallel editing internally to a single scene. Yeah, whereas parallel editing, I think, is another example of time expansion where you have to expand time because these events are happening simultaneously. So you're showing one while the other side is happening. Yeah. So you have to go back and forth, and it's slowing down time just inherently because of you having to show both events, at some point.
Well, and we're really...
Yeah, so the sweating example is like you're going back and forth, and you're going back and forth, and it's like all of this is happening at once, but on screen it's happening over 5 minutes, even though it's only supposed to take 1 minute.
Right.
Yeah, it's the time that we're talking about could be characters' time. It can be viewers' time, right? So it could be the story's time. Yeah. It could be the time of the person, or it could be the time of the viewer. So like in Inception, time is for the viewer changing than the character. Like it's really
changing more for the character than.
But they're going opposite direction.
It's going the other way for the character versus the viewer.
It's inverse. It's inverse. And I think you could say in the case of the bomb ticking down, it's an expansion of time kind of for both of us. I mean, there's the aspect of, how much time does it take as a viewer? That's one level of time.
Yeah.
There's how much time is actually happening in the story, like objectively.
I'm going to call it diegetic time.
Okay. Did you make that up, by the way?
I don't know if diegetic time is a real term, but diegetic is definitely, that means like the world of the story. So story world time is diegetic time.
Someone needs to quote you in a textbook now that you've used that word. And then there's the how much time does it feel like to the character, right? Yeah. So the person who's doing the bomb is like a million things are going on in their head, and so the 10 seconds for them may feel like 30 seconds or an hour, right?
Well, or I think of Back to the Future is a good example. You have from 1955 to 1985 as the full arc of the story, yet really it exists within 2 weeks, but separated by
2 weeks for the
years.
Character. But
Exactly, and then how much time, and then they cut that down more because we're not going to watch 6 real days. So it's like, and of course in Back to the Future they get to jump back and forth to different realities of time, which I think is a whole nother line of things.
Yeah, we should do another podcast on time travel.
Because I think you guys brought up time travel before we've been talking, and I think that time travel and Inception too, as another example of like a weird kind of time travel in a way, is not necessarily tied to how time is presented on the screen.
It's really not.
Yeah.
Well, and if we think about it even deeper, time for us here on Earth is different than time somewhere else on another planet.
Should we get into the theory of general relativity?
How we measure it and all that kind of stuff, how much we're falling in space, all that kind of stuff. So like our perception really is
what is reality?
What is reality? Well,
that's the other. I want to make a second Videomaker podcast, like the alternative version where we talk about philosophy and the meaning of reality.
Yeah, and if aliens exist, and if we can ever get a time machine or whatever. I surprisingly had the conversation with my wife the other day about if a time machine actually could happen, and we decided no.
Oh, okay. So, geez, major tangent here. The argument for the time machine is you can't travel back in time before the time machine was invented, which is why that we haven't seen any time travelers from the future, because as soon as you invent the time machine, then you'll start to see time travelers coming back from the future.
Okay.
That's my theory. Anyways,
yeah, okay.
Yeah. So another fun example of time compression, this is an example of time compression and time expansion, I think simultaneously, is the scene from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. You guys may remember the scene where, I think it's Lancelot is storming a castle, and he's running across the field, and then it cuts to the guards outside the castle, and they're watching him. And then it cuts back to Lancelot, and he's running across the field, but it's like he's reset. He's like back where he started, and it goes back to the guards, and they're watching him. It goes back, and he's reset again, running across the field, and he's like making no progress. And then suddenly he's there, stabbing the guy and running inside. So that scene is like, it's clearly an expansion of time again for the characters, because they're like they see this guy running, and he just never gets there. Yet for us as viewers, he gets there pretty quick if you actually compared it to how much time it would take to run across this field.
What movie? Oh, Clue. Just watched the movie Clue. My son watched it for the first time, loves it. And it's one of my wife's favorite movies, so she's really excited to watch it with him. But there, the story unravels in real time until people start getting murdered and they start accusing, and then they have 3 endings. And each one of those 3 endings is, someone explaining what everything's going to happen, all that kind of thing. But the pace picks up each time a new ending happens, of the explanation and all that kind of stuff, which starts making you a fever pitch of watching it, and all the energy there that you get, I guess real time and then compressed time right after it, which probably makes other time feel different because of relative time.
It's funny that you think of Clue as the example of that. My example of that is Wayne's World. Same thing at the end, remember?
Oh yeah, they have different endings and all the rest.
But it all starts with the same thing, where they're like in the house and the van pulls up or something.
Yeah, it's like
But they just sort of skip over those little details of, as they tell it multiple times.
Right. Yeah, because
you don't have to say Mr. Big and all that stuff again and all. Yeah, exactly. You don't have to introduce the character. That is a good one. And of course, that one is supposed to be happening in real time too. That like things are coming down, but they're setting it up.
Yeah. Okay, maybe we should take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about real time, and maybe if there's time, we can talk more about slow motion techniques. Be right back. For years, Videomaker has been producing quality video training to help you take your video skills to the next level. Now you can access it all from a Videomaker Plus account. We've got courses covering everything from learning how to navigate your camera with our course on camera controls and settings to learning about color grading or even how to start a video business. Videomaker Plus has something for you. The Videomaker library is split into 4 levels. If you're just starting, try our inexpensive starter level membership, which gets you access to essential video training and a digital subscription to Videomaker magazine. For the most professional training, go all the way up to our professional tier membership, which gives you access to our entire library of training, which covers advanced concepts like running a video business or becoming a documentary filmmaker. Plus, the professional tier is the only membership with access to our popular webinar recordings. Plus, right now, for a limited time, you can get the professional tier of Videomaker Plus for the price of the creative tier. That's $100 savings. Sign up at videomaker.com/spring deal. That's videomaker.com/spring deal. Okay, welcome back. So let's see, there's actually one other storytelling version of time that we didn't discuss, which is like real time. And I guess this is the opposite of time manipulation. This is like time non-manipulation.
Well, you're still manipulating time. It's just what you're representing is different, right?
Well,
yeah.
Depending on the situation.
So
I think that we again have to separate like story time and screen time and pro-filmic time, like actual filming time.
Yeah.
Yeah, because no matter what, like going back to the idea, like inherently by editing, you're going to cut out the stuff that wasn't supposed to be part of the story, so you're compressing that pro-filmic time.
Yeah, of actually taking it. But we're talking about the characters and the story and the time the viewer experiences.
Yeah, so it's 90 minutes of screen time and it's 90 minutes of story time.
Yeah, we're talking about minute for minute
that's
what
real,
you're watching.
real time.
And so what a good example of that was Birdman.
Birdman, yep, 1917.
1917. And those are obviously weren't, they look like continuous shots, and that's really fun to, I haven't seen 1917
Actually,
yet.
I do think in 1917 there is a shift in time from night to day or day to night.
But it seems like it's continuing.
Yeah, so there's a difference there because it's one of those one-shot type of, it's fake one shot, one take kind of movies. But I seem to recall there is actually a jump in time. You don't actually see sunrise and all that. But it is one continuous take. Birdman I think is supposed to be totally real time.
Yeah. The show 24 was supposed to be 24 1-hour episodes to show you one full day. However,
with
was
22 minutes of commercials.
Yeah, was it actually representing real time? No, it was just what it was supposed to be representing. Because I'm sure they did the same thing with the clock ticking down, and it's got 10 seconds left, and then 5 minutes later they finally defuse the bomb. Like, okay, that doesn't make any sense. But they're supposed to be trying to represent that an hour passes in an hour.
Right,
but
in 24.
What happens is you end up getting some stuff that slows down, stuff that speeds up. So it ends up being an hour that you experience. But they still are, within the story.
Yeah, what they're probably doing is they're probably compressing time within a scene and overlapping scenes.
Yeah, exactly. So you can see more and get more understanding. That's exactly because they cut to a clock, tick, 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 or the squares. So you see that scene ending, and then there's another one that they shift to, and it goes from there. And that's where the transitions really come in to telling that story of real time.
Another example that's not like a super great movie, but it's an interesting example is Time Code. It's 4 different points of view. It's filmed basically in one take. It's supposed to be filmed in one take with 4 different cameras, and then you watch it in a quad view, so you can see all the cameras at once.
And is that one of those ones where at the end they all sort of settle together into the same?
I can't remember if they actually settle together, but the stories definitely get more and more intertwined as the movie progresses. But yeah, also I think thinking about real time in cinema makes me think of Gus Van Sant films, Elephant, Last Days. I forget what other ones were really big from him, but he uses real time somewhat selectively. So like I think it's an Elephant that's the scene of the kid walking down the hallway, and it's just following this kid down the hallway, walking down the hallway, and it feels really long, but it's just like normal walking pace. But because we're so used to that being cut out of movies, it feels really long. So it's just real time, but like because of the way it's used in context of like the rest of cinema, it has a different effect.
My favorite example is High Noon. Maybe it's just because, I don't know, I watched it in college and I loved it. So High Noon is the example of it's you know, I don't remember the total time, 90 minutes or something, but the idea is, you know, bad guys coming to town. This is a Western, and you know, the sheriff's got to take care of it, and he's got 90 minutes to figure out how he's going to deal with this bad guy, and he's trying to get help. And but yeah, 90 minutes, and they use the clock to like point back to this is how much time's left, and you know, it's as long as the film is, that's how much time he's got to take care of things.
Right.
And we already talked a little bit about this, but like likely your wedding ceremonies, you might compress time of all the people walking down the aisle, because you know that can be time consuming. But once the actual ceremony happens, most times you're looking for a real time, just what it was like for the ceremony. For whatever reason, that's a thing they want to, you know, you want to relive that standing up there in front of everybody thing, and that is always presented in real time. You might do a highlights or something like that, but that's a thing, that's a story that's always there. You know, there's a lot of stuff that obviously the news is represented in real time. I mean, obviously because it's live, so live events and that kind of thing, and looking outside a narrative.
Yeah, that's like a meta narrative, I guess, right? In the sense that you're watching the news, which maybe seeing the anchors reading the news is its own timeline, and then there's the timeline of the story that they're telling, which is then compressed, right?
Yeah,
because they're trying to tell you what happened in 90 seconds,
Right. And they still have to leave out the irrelevant, less interesting parts.
Yeah.
In
The
whatever
reporter
narrative
drove
that
to
they,
Durham today
whatever,
and pulled out his camera, and
first he was in the rightmost lane and he stayed there.
yeah. Then he wanted a cigarette, but he didn't have cigarettes, so he had to go to the store to get cigarettes.
So let's move on to maybe the technical side of things. So we talked about slow motion and time lapse as like these really overt ways to manipulate time, and shooting these things is not exactly just like setting up your camera and pointing at anything otherwise, right?
Yeah.
So there's some kind of specific things you need to do if you want to shoot good slow motion and good time lapse, right? So slow motion is really all about frame rates, right?
Yeah, the whole idea of overcranking, right? So you're shooting more frames to play back at a smaller frame rate. So, you know, the idea of 60 frames per second, you're shooting at that, and then you get 2.5 times slow-mo, so 2.5 times slower than real time when you watch it back at 24 frames a second.
Yes. So you can think about, it's always easiest for me to think about this in terms of film in a film camera. You know, the term overcranking is them cranking it faster so that more frames are exposed during a second. Well, when you get those individual frames on your film roll and you want to present it back, you put it on the projector, and the projector plays it back at 24 frames a second.
Right.
Even though you were like just cranking like crazy to get it up to 60 or whatever.
Yeah, so you have to capture those extra frames in order for it to look good when it slows down too.
Yeah, because otherwise it's like a slideshow. You know, you're seeing
the
one image
version
after another
Yeah.
is like a slideshow. The first time this really hit me on slow motion was shooting on some of the point and shoot Sony cameras have 960 frames per second. They're fixed lens, they're small sensors, and they had a limit of like 7 seconds of being able to record at that. And it's like, okay, that seems kind of short, 7 seconds. And that used to be the way, like, oh, we give you 4K, but it's for 5 minutes, that's it. But then you think about it, if you're shooting at 4 slow-mo, 960 frames per second is 40 times slow-mo. So you're getting 40 seconds of video per 1 second filmed if you slow it down to 24 frames a second. So you're getting such an expansion of time from that a lot of things don't look to even be changing, right? So that's about choosing the right frame rate to show the action that you need at the speed you want.
Yeah.
Because at 960 frames a second, fire looks really cool, but me looking up is really slow. Like if I'm trying to get a human's action, it's like I get to see you blink.
Yeah.
And it took 10 seconds.
Slow motion isn't necessarily about going the highest frame rate. it's the right frame rate for your subject. And a lot of times it's just 60, even just doubling it or a little more than doubling it and then going back to 30 or 24.
Yeah,
is enough to make a dramatic effect.
And why are you using it, right? So a lot of times it's for dream sequence, right? Or to suspend reality to make something seem more elegant a lot of times moving stuff, slowing down.
Or just dramatic or like more badass.
Yeah.
Like they use that in like a powerful person and superheroes coming onto the scene. They're getting there to save the day. Like they get a slow-mo intro.
Yeah, everything's more epic. The flag waving in slow-mo.
You don't even need to do that much slow motion, You like, if you do the 24 frames to 60 frames at 2.5x, it's super dramatic.
Yeah. That's human actions hardly ever look good over 120 frames per second. Our actions are not fast enough to really make that something. So when you get above that, you're now talking about faster moving subjects. So you're talking about someone on a vehicle, in a vehicle, moving, or an animal moving. Just like things that are moving faster. Yeah, and it. A lot of times, we see a lot of frame rates, from up to 960. Man, that seems like so many, but then you think of like a Phantom Flex that can shoot 20,000, 40,000 frames per second. So you're talking about
a little postage stamp resolution.
Yeah, well, and you're talking about things that are done in a blink of an eye.
Yeah.
So this is an explosion, gun bullet, or gun bullet. I don't know if there's any bullets for other things, but
there's the kind that makes salsa.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Nerf bullets.
The bullet.
That's a gun bullet.
Nerf bullet. Yeah, that's a gun bullet still.
So there's also time-lapse, which is basically the same thing, but in reverse, right?
Yeah.
You're capturing fewer frames over the period of time versus more frames over a period of time.
Right. So if you want to get that like really dramatic shot of the clouds sort of changing in the sky, you take 1 frame a minute or something.
Right. And then you speed it up.
And it's really, the interval is where you're doing your time, right? So if you're saying, I want to take 1 frame every minute, that means in 24 minutes, I'm going to have 1 second of video. If I'm shooting it, I'm trying to make it in 24 frames a second.
Yeah.
So
you kind of have the opposite problem of like, what do I do with 4 minutes of slow-mo? That's like a lot of slow-mo versus what do I do with 1 second of time-lapse? Like that's not enough.
Yeah, exactly. So like that's the thing is time-lapse can take a long time. You could, it could take you it could take you a year to make a second, just depending on how much you're sampling that the time there, and so. But the other thing about that is like you can see things then that you couldn't see normally. So those beautiful Milky Way shots of the stars, and then they're all moving overnight. Like you're watching movement over hours, but you're also seeing really long exposures, so they can actually gather all the light from all those stars, so it seems even more rich. And that's when you can't have cars passing by or whatever. Light pollution is an issue then. You really can't pull out your phone to check your email. It might affect the exposure of your shot because it's all about controlling that light.
Yeah. And in that case, that's like one of the harder time lapses because you don't want streaks, so you have to track the movement of the stars as you're doing your long exposure, and then you're also trying to do time lapse on top of that.
Yeah, and if you don't want the stars to streak, you're doing, okay, how slow is just slow enough, but not too slow to make it streaky, how far, and I mean, there's a lot of guidelines for that kind of stuff. I mean, definitely, in fact, a lot of the intervalometers now. But maybe don't
start with stars, maybe start with a sunset.
Yes.
Or maybe not even a sunset, but like the clouds.
Is really easy.
Because the sunset has the same problem of exposure changing.
The clouds, a busy intersection, that you can help speed up time and doing that kind of something that you can sample multiple times a minute will get you through a time-lapse sequence for making 10 seconds of video or something relatively quick. Don't choose that thing's going to take you 24 hours because it's going to take you 24 hours to realize you screwed up. So it's, those are the...
At least have like a vision and be willing to like work to get there if you're going to do like a longer time lapse.
So clouds are really easy and it looks super cool when you're done. The other one that looks really cool, you said cars at an intersection, but I would say cars like traveling down the freeway at night. Mm-hmm. You get these like really cool streaky red and white lights. A
stop line is really great though because they come up, they streak up, and then they get clear, and then they get streaky again. So you get this, you get a lot more energy in that. But, you know, I mean, the thing is, if you have multiple cameras, I always think about myself, and I have lots of cameras, so I just, well, add more cameras if you want less risk. You know, shoot 5 cameras at a time at all different exposures, and eventually you'll have, you know, one of them will work for you what you're doing. But likely you could just go research it and find the right interval to start from. And that's really the biggest thing about it, is like, and like I was, a lot of the intervalometers in them. In fact, what was it? It was the Canon EOS RP has intervalometer in it, and actually has like subject matter. Like, so you're doing a sunset. Okay, cool. It's going to tell you what exposure mode to be in because your light's changing over time.
Yeah.
Versus, you know, which is pretty difficult if you're trying to keep it without making it all flickery and all that kind of stuff. There's things to think about before you actually shoot them. But time lapse is, it's just really neat because I think it gets you thinking as a videographer and as a photographer at the same time.
Yeah.
It gets you thinking, okay, outside of what you can do with normal video, but you have to understand video, otherwise you just have a bunch of photos. And you got to be able to put them together.
You won't be able to visualize how this movement will come across on screen.
Yeah, exactly. Camera movement is what we are as videographers or filmmakers. That's the thing we do that they have to imply in a still image. You know, you have to do a longer exposure to imply movement. You can't just move.
So the last thing is like the intercutting between these two things. And I say intercutting, but this is like kind of without cuts. This is the typical example of this is usually in superhero movies where there's a fight scene and the superhero moves very fast, and then suddenly it kind of time slows down and they do this like slow motion punch or something, and then it speeds up again as they, you know, reposition themselves to punch the next guy or something.
Right.
Like that.
With Sherlock is who we were talking about earlier, the movie where, and it's important because it's also part of the story of showing how smart the guy is, right? That he's thinking all these things through, so it's showing his intelligence, that he's working on a totally different level than all those around him. So it like really plays for the story, but also is a really cool just time manipulation as far as that goes. And they also do it with color too, whereas it gets desaturated when it goes slow, and then real time gets back, your color comes back, and so that kind of thing.
They have to like slow it down in order to express all of those thoughts that are, you know, going in this character's head.
Yeah, like to show
where
the complexity of his thought. Yeah.
And I feel like that's a more self-aware like technique, use of this technique to bring drama into that versus just a regular slowing down and speeding up. Like that's the first example that Mike gave is much more like subtle of an example, and you're not as aware of this time manipulation that's happening. It's just kind of like it feels almost natural that moment would be slower, and maybe that's because we're used to it as a convention, or maybe it's because we just expect that kind of impact to happen.
I always
that weight to be put on that moment.
I think it's all about that climax shot, right? So it's like the guy gets punched in the jaw, his mouthpiece goes flying in slow motion with the spit, and you go, you know, that
part
kind
of
of
that
thing.
is clearly just like aesthetic. They want to dramatize
it.
split second moment,
or like hitting a baseball that's about to, you know, lose its thread and go over the.
It just brings emphasis.
Yeah, it shows there's something important going on here. And we're going to slow it down so you really get to have the impact of what this thing is.
So can either of you guys think of a movie or a TV show or some sort of story where the time in the story is longer than the time it takes to watch?
Like everything. Or do you mean the reverse?
Yeah, sorry, the reverse. The time is short, in the story is shorter.
So you use it to make time longer.
You're expanding time throughout.
So
like a story where in the story only a few minutes have passed, but it takes an hour.
I think in the parallel editing type of thing, there's a lot of that where you could have 4 stories that all unravel at the same time. The 4 Rooms is a good example of that. That it's like 15 minutes per scene, but that they're all happening at the same time. But it took an hour to watch 15 minutes unfold because you get to watch 4 stories throughout.
Yeah. I was looking to parallel editing too, and even like the Great Train Robbery, which is like heralded as like one of the first examples of parallel editing.
Yeah.
But I think anytime that's happening, you automatically are like doubling time or whatever. I mean, there's compression happening within each like track, I guess. But yeah.
So maybe Pulp Fiction is this?
maybe.
I'd have to watch it again. There's
Pulp Fiction happens over a longer period than 2 hours. I'm pretty sure of it.
Well, there's the challenge for listeners.
But even I was thinking about Superbad because that's like just an evening, but it'd be 4 hours compressed or whatever.
This is a conceptual film that exists somewhere.
Yeah, someone thought about, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make this 10 minutes last an hour. Sounds kind of agonizing unless the story's really good, or I think parallel editing is one of the only ways you can make it compelling.
Where you have more events happening than once, or where events are iterating and repeating, maybe. But that's like another weird time travel thing.
Mm-hmm. Or if you talk about,
it has to exist.
I think it's more about like a really. I would think of a scene that there's a lot of stuff going on, and you end up telling the story of all the people in the room, like everybody's perspective, or like you shift perspective. So
is that Clue?
No, Clue ends up always being through the butler's eyes. He's the one talking to the camera and directing the story, versus like. Maybe what's the when frogs rain from the sky? Magnolia, where they have lots of different stories going on that all of a sudden come to culminate, but that's not in real time.
Yeah,
but it's definitely that's more of just like stories converging.
I guess the answer is no. No one can think of one.
No one can think of one, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
No, I mean, guarantee it exists.
And I would like to make a recommendation if you want to think about time in weird ways. You should watch Primer.
Yeah, watch it at least twice.
Yeah.
Have you seen that movie, Chris?
I don't know if I have.
So this is the type of movie where it's a time travel movie. Mm-hmm. I think Nicole and I have talked about this before.
Yeah.
I think that the filmmakers in this case were being intentionally trying to obscure the timeline. They wanted to make it hard to follow.
Yeah. And they leave the language really dense. Like the exposition isn't really exposition because a lot of it is like too fast or going over your head, or like the timeline is weird anyway, so you don't really know what they're talking about. Like I haven't seen that movie in a while, but I do remember it's a trip.
You got to watch it, and then you have to afterwards get someone to draw a diagram for you of the timeline and the characters.
I kind of feel like Kevin Smith kind of does this in some of his in thinking Mallrats mostly takes up real time, but there's no really explanation of what time it is. But it's because the scene's all there and it's all just happening in an afternoon or something. Yeah. But it's just how much of expansion time did they do?
And I feel like with that, it's like that's kind of the style, like with Gus Van Sant, but in a comedic version of that, I guess, where it's like this is just casually happening.
Yeah, that's like the extraordinary story about this is that everything's really ordinary.
Yeah.
Okay, so speaking of time, we are out of time, or at least I'm out of time. So I think we should call it there. So this is a fun topic. We really need to do another episode on time travel, I think.
Yeah. Now I'm going to go watch all 3 Back to the Futures.
Okay.
Yes. You know what? I watched Back to the Future 3 like last weekend. I love Back to the Future, and it's been several years since I watched it, and it's just like, this actually isn't that good.
Well, 3 was like the one, like they're like, let's make a little bit more money. Let's do 2 and 3 at the same time, and then 3 ended up being the one. 2 is my favorite, and I would go 2, 1, 3, and that's the order I'd watch it in, because I don't really care about it.
It doesn't matter. It's a time story.
Yeah.
You're just like doing it in your own timeline.
Except for it reveals stuff in different orders, but you got to know stuff. Right?
Okay, we'll call that a day. So thanks everyone for watching.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
See ya.
Where we're going, we don't need roads.
Thanks everyone for listening. Again, if you like this podcast, we would love it if you went over to iTunes and left us a 5-star review. It's super, super helpful for new podcasts like ours. For Nicole Lajeunesse, Chris Monlux, and everyone here at Videomaker, I'm Mike Wilhelm, and you've been listening to the Videomaker Podcast. We'll catch you next time.